Today's tech news moves fast, but understanding it shouldn't be hard. That's why Snarful Solutions Group brings you Connecting the Dots, where we break down what's happening in tech and why it matters to you. Now, let's dive in with your hosts.
Okay, let's get straight to it. Today is Friday, April 4th, 2025. Quick weather check first. If you're in the lower Ohio Valley or the Mid-South, heads up. Sounds like a pretty serious situation with life-threatening flash flooding.
Yeah, definitely concerning.
And we're also seeing warnings for significant severe weather. We're talking large hail, strong tornadoes even, real possibility from the Mid-South through the Ozarks and into Arklatex. So, yeah, keep an eye on those forecasts, seriously.
Absolutely. Stay safe out there. And shifting gears to the markets. Well, it's not looking pretty today.
No, definitely a sea of red.
Yeah.
The Dow Jones is down 2.55%, and the S&P 500 is taking an even bigger hit, down 2.95%. Some big moves happening.
Indeed. A reminder that the world keeps turning, often with, well, considerable force, whether that's weather or markets. And that brings us to why we're here. You're joining us for Connecting the Dots, a deep dive from us here at Snarful Solutions Group. Our goal today is simple. Make sense of the top 3 tech news stories breaking right now and really understand how these seemingly abstract events could, have tangible effects on your daily life.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond just the headlines and figuring out, well, what really matters and how it all fits together. So let's jump right into our first story. This one's coming out of China. They've just implemented some new export restrictions on certain rare earth elements. Went into effect today, actually. And this looks like, well, pretty clearly a direct response to the tariffs the U.S. under President Trump has been putting in place.
Right. Tit for tat, it seems.
Yeah. Now, for anyone listening, you might be thinking, rare earth elements? Why should I care about some obscure-sounding materials?
That's a great question, and it's easy to overlook them. But these rare earths, despite the name, they're actually crucial ingredients in so much of the tech we rely on every single day.
Like what, specifically?
Well, think about the powerful magnets that make electric vehicles efficient, or the vibrant displays on your smartphones and laptops, even vital components in renewable energy like wind turbines and important defense systems, too. They're kind of the hidden workhorses behind a lot of cutting-edge innovation.
And when it comes to getting these materials, China really holds a dominant position globally, right? It's not like they're just a minor player here.
Oh, absolutely not. Dominant is the right word. We're talking about China being responsible for roughly 90% of the world's refined rare earth production.
Wow. Refined is key there, isn't it?
It is. It's not just about where they're mined. They have this massive grip on the processing capabilities as well. And that makes them a really pivotal supplier for major economies, especially the United States.
Okay, so which specific elements are we talking about with these new restrictions? I noticed a couple of slightly different lists floating around.
You're right. There is a bit of nuance there in the reporting. DevDiscourse mentioned restrictions on several categories of medium and heavy rare earths, specifically calling out samarium and yttrium.
Okay.
But then Ucore Rare Metals, a company we'll talk more about in a sec, listed a slightly broader range. They included samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium. So yeah, the focus really seems to be on these heavier types, which are particularly vital for certain advanced applications like magnets and lasers.
Gotcha. Now, this isn't a complete ban on exporting these elements, as I understand it. It's more about, like, controlling the flow.
Precisely. It's not a full stop. The Chinese government is implementing these restrictions by limiting the issuance of export licenses rather than imposing a complete shutdown. It's a tactic we've actually seen them use before in other sectors.
Really? Like what?
Like with antimony exports to the EU a while back, it gives them a significant lever to pull, to exert pressure or make a point without completely disrupting the global supply chain overnight. It's strategic.
So what could be the wider implications of this kind of move on a global scale? This feels significant.
It really is. What's really significant here is that it throws China's considerable power, not just in mining, but crucially in the processing sectors, into sharp relief. Everyone sees it clearly now. And actions like this are very likely to push other nations, particularly the U.S. and its allies, to, well, aggressively pursue the development of their own alternative, more secure supply chains for these critical materials. It's all about reducing dependence on a single dominant source.
Makes sense. And on that note, Ucore Rare Metals, you mentioned them. They're a North American company, right? They've been quite vocal about this development. Seems like they see it as a clear validation of their work.
They do indeed. I mean, for a company like Ucore, whose entire focus is on establishing a robust rare earth supply chain within North America, this news basically underscores the urgency and strategic importance of what they're trying to do.
Right, they're probably saying, see, we told you so.
Pretty much. They're essentially saying, this is exactly why we need to build up our own capabilities, independent of potential disruptions elsewhere.
And they have some pretty interesting initiatives already in progress, don't they? Like their plant in Ontario and the planned facility down in Louisiana.
Yeah, they're actively working on it. Ucore is currently operating their Rapid SX commercial demonstration plan up in Kingston, Ontario. There, they're processing heavy rare earth elements, actually under a $4 million contract with the U.S. Department of Defense. So that's a key step in proving their tech works at a larger scale.
Okay, DoD involvement, that's notable.
Definitely. And looking ahead, their Louisiana Strategic Metals Complex, the SMC in Alexandria, that's designed to process both heavy and light mixed rare earth concentrates. Again, the fundamental goal is making North America less reliant on foreign supplies.
And it sounds like they've also received some important backing, both from the Canadian government and potentially from Louisiana itself.
That's right. They secured $4.28 million in funding from the Government of Canada specifically for advancing their Rapid SX technology. That's their separation tech.
Got it.
And they also have a non-binding letter of intent with the state of Louisiana that could translate to around $15 million in various incentives. This kind of government support is often absolutely vital for these big strategic industrial projects. They're expensive.
Absolutely. And, all of this kind of dovetails with recent actions by the U.S. government, too, doesn't it? I remember President Trump invoking the Defense Production Act just last month.
Yes, exactly. If we connect these dots here, President Trump's decision back on March 20th to invoke wartime powers under the DPA, that was a very clear signal. The U.S. government intends to seriously bolster domestic mineral production, and rare earths were definitely a central priority in that announcement.
So Ucore must be pretty pleased with that alignment.
Oh, for sure. Ucore themselves have publicly stated they're eager to continue their collaboration with the Department of Defense in this, evolving landscape. It fits right into their strategy.
Pat Ryan, the CEO of Ucore, even put out a statement, and it sounded pretty pointed, pretty direct.
It did. He said, and I'm quoting here, China's recent announcement highlights the urgent need for a robust and independent rare earth supply chain in North America. Ucore's Rapid SX technology offers a transformative solution to this challenge. Strong words. And we're committed to advancing our strategic initiatives to ensure a stable and secure supply of critical rare earth elements.
Yeah, doesn't mince words there. Emphasizes how their work aligns with the current, geopolitical realities.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so bringing this back to you, the listener, how might these restrictions on rare earth exports potentially touch your everyday life? It might seem abstract, but what are the real-world connections we should be thinking about?
Right. This is where it becomes less abstract and more, real. Think about the tech you use constantly, your smartphone. It relies on these elements for its speakers, the vibrating motor.
Huh, didn't know that.
Yeah. Your laptop screen uses them for color accuracy. If you're considering an electric vehicle or own one, the powerful magnets in its motor are heavily dependent on these very same rare earth elements, especially the heavier ones we mentioned.
Okay, so supply gets tighter, prices could go up.
That's the potential chain reaction. If the supply of these materials becomes restricted or just more expensive because of these export controls, we could very well see that reflected in the price of these goods eventually. Maybe not tomorrow, but down the line.
Right.
There could also be potential delays or even shifts in the availability of certain technologies as manufacturers scramble to adjust to a changing supply chain. It's a complex web, but this is a key point of potential impact for everyday consumers.
Definitely something to keep in mind, especially as we become, increasingly reliant on all these technologies. All right, let's shift gears. Let's move on to our second big story. The European Union's response to those U.S. tariffs.
Ah, yes, the trade tensions continue.
It seems President Trump's decision to increase tariffs on steel and aluminum imports hasn't gone down too well across the Atlantic, to put it mildly.
That's definitely putting it mildly. Those increased tariffs on U.S. steel and aluminum imports, which kicked in earlier this week, Wednesday, I believe, that was a significant move by the U.S. And the EU has been very clear they intend to retaliate. No surprise there.
And their initial plan is to hit back with their own counter tariffs, starting next month already. That's a pretty swift reaction.
It is. The European Commission has announced they'll be imposing counter tariffs on a substantial amount, 26 billion euros worth of U.S. goods. That's about $28.33 billion. And yeah, they're set to take effect next month, so sometime after April 1st, we're definitely seeing a clear tit-for-tat dynamic emerging in global trade right now.
And we also heard some strong words from France's European Affairs Minister, Benjamin Haddad. He suggested the EU might be prepared to go even further in their response. That kind of raises the stakes, doesn't it?
It does. And what's particularly interesting, I thought, was his suggestion that the EU could consider targeting digital services. Think about the big names Google, Amazon, Meta, Apple, Microsoft, or even intellectual property as potential future countermeasures.
Wow, digital services, that's a whole different arena.
Exactly. That would represent a significant escalation of the trade dispute, bringing in entirely new sectors that weren't part of the initial steel and aluminum fight. It could get much broader.
This all feels like it's part of a much bigger shift in global trade relationships, doesn't it? It's not just these isolated incidents anymore.
I think you're spot on. If we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, these tariffs are creating a situation where companies in the EU and really across the globe face this risk of losing access, or at least facing higher costs, to get into the very large U.S. consumer market.
Right, a huge market.
Huge. And this is where the dynamics with China become even more complex and interesting. While there are certainly existing tensions and concerns about, overproduction and political issues with China, the prospect of facing high tariffs in the U.S. could make China look like a potentially more attractive alternative market or partner for some European companies. It shifts the calculus.
And the tariff rates being imposed by the U.S. aren't trivial, are they? We're talking pretty significant numbers.
Oh, no, definitely not small adjustments. We're talking about a 20% across-the-board tariff on the EU for many goods, and even higher rates for key industries like cars and trucks. And for China, as we touched on with the rare earths discussion, some tariffs are exceeding 50%. These are substantial barriers being erected in international trade.
Interestingly, though, amidst all this tension, there seems to be some maybe early indication of a potential thaw in relations between the EU and China in one specific area. That caught my eye, seemed a bit surprising.
It is a noteworthy development, yeah. Despite the broader trade friction, there are reports surfacing that negotiations between the EU and China concerning tariffs, specifically on electric vehicles, are actually being restarted.
Huh. EVs. Why EVs, do you think?
Well, it's a huge growth market, massive investment on both sides. It suggests that even in a climate of pretty intense trade disputes, there might be specific sectors where mutual economic interests are strong enough to still drive dialogue and potentially some level of de-escalation or cooperation. It's not all at war on every front.
But overall, it still sounds like the strategy, or maybe the lack of a clear one, behind President Trump's tariffs is creating a lot of uncertainty, even among those who might typically be supportive.
You're right. There seems to be a growing concern, reportedly even within Republican circles, about the lack of a clear long-term strategy or endgame behind these tariffs. What's the goal? And what about the potential for significant negative economic consequences? That absence of a well-defined plan is definitely contributing to market unease and broader anxiety.
Okay, so zooming back into the listener again.
Yeah.
How might all this tariff talk, these potential trade war scenarios, how could that affect your everyday life? It might seem like something happening at a very high level between governments.
But it has very real potential to impact you directly. I mean, think about the goods you purchase. If these tariffs lead to increased costs for European or, say, Chinese manufacturers importing into the U.S. or U.S. goods going the other way, those costs could eventually be passed on to consumers. Higher prices at the checkout.
Well, right. Inflationary pressure.
Exactly. And the digital services you use, your streaming, your social media, your cloud storage, they could also be affected if they become targets of these retaliatory tariffs Benjamin Haddad mentioned.
Didn't think about that.
And maybe more broadly, the overall stability and growth of the global economy, which is absolutely influenced by these major trade relationships. Well, that can have a ripple effect on everything, from job markets to interest rates on loans to your retirement investments. It's all interconnected.
Definitely a lot of interconnected pieces moving right now. Okay, let's turn our attention to our third big story for today. The rather dramatic fall we've seen in tech stock values, specifically following President Trump's tariff announcements. The numbers we're seeing are pretty striking.
They are indeed stark, really. The announcement of these new global tariffs really sent a jolt through the tech sector, leading to significant sell-offs for many, many major companies. The market did not like it.
Let's just run through some of the specifics because they're quite something. We saw reports of Amazon and Meta both closing down by around 9%. That's huge for companies that size.
Massive drops. NVIDIA also took a substantial hit, down 7.8%. Alphabet, Google's parent, down 3.9%. And even Microsoft saw a decline of 2.4%. But yeah, some other companies experienced even steeper drops. Unbelievably.
Like who?
Well, looking at the S&P 500 specifically, Dell Technologies really stood out. They plummeted a massive 19% in one day.
19%.
19. The most significant drop within the entire index. HP wasn't far behind, down 15%. And companies involved in hardware data storage, like Western Digital, they experienced an 18% decline. And then there's Apple.
Apple. Always a bellwether. How'd they do?
Plummeted, down 9.4%. Reportedly, that was its worst single day since the market turmoil back in March 2020, early days of the pandemic panic. And that single-day drop wiped out an astonishing $315 billion in market capitalization, just gone.
Wow, $315 billion. Those are truly staggering numbers. It really highlights the market's immediate negative reaction to this tariff news.
So what are the likely underlying reasons for such a sharp and widespread decline, specifically in tech stock values?
Well, the primary concerns really center around the potential for higher costs within their international supply chains. Most big tech companies operate these incredibly complex global networks for sourcing components, manufacturing, assembling their products. Tariffs directly increase the cost of those imported inputs.
Makes sense. And furthermore, there's the worry that these increased costs, whether the companies absorb them, hitting their margins, or pass them on to consumers through higher prices, could lead to a decrease in overall consumer spending. People might buy fewer gadgets if they're more expensive, or if they're just generally worried about the economy.
Right, belts tighten.
Exactly. So investors are essentially anticipating a negative impact on these companies' future earnings and profitability, and they're selling off shares as a result.
And it wasn't just the tech sector that felt the impact, was it? It sounds like the broader market experienced a pretty significant downturn as well.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't isolated. The tariff announcement triggered what many are describing as the worst day for the major stock indexes overall since, June 2020. The S&P 500 fell by a significant 4.8%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped almost 1,700 points. That's close to a 4% decline. And the NASDAQ Composite, which is heavily weighted with tech stocks, it plummeted nearly 6%. And even the Russell 2000, which tracks smaller companies, saw a substantial drop of 6.6%. So this indicates a really broad market concern about the potential economic fallout from these tariffs. It spooked investors across the board.
Interestingly, though, it seems like some sectors actually kind of bucked this trend, performed relatively well during the downturn. That's often a sign of investors seeking safer havens, right?
Exactly. Classic defensive rotation. In times of economic uncertainty, investors often gravitate towards more stable, less economically sensitive sectors. So we saw consumer staples, companies that produce essential goods people buy regardless, like Coca-Cola, General Mills, Lamb Weston. They generally saw gains as investors sought out these more defensive stocks.
Okay, makes sense.
And discount retailers like TJX, think TJ Maxx, Marshalls, and Ross stores, they also fared relatively well. The thinking there is they cater to consumers who become more price conscious during economic downturns.
Right, people look for bargains.
Precisely. However, it's worth noting that bank stocks were sharply lower. That reflects increased anxieties about potential recession risks, which often hit financials hard.
It's also important to point out there seems to be a specific exemption, at least for now, regarding semiconductors coming from one key region in Asia, right? That's such a critical component for so much of tech.
Yes, that's a crucial detail. For the time being, semiconductors chips originating from Taiwan have been exempted from these new country-specific tariffs. This is particularly significant for companies like NVIDIA, who rely heavily on advanced chips manufactured by Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company, TSMC.
Huge supplier.
The biggest. However, it's still somewhat unclear whether these companies will ultimately be subject to the broader blanket 10% tariff that applies to imports from most other countries. So, while it's a temporary reprieve on the targeted tariff, the full impact on the semiconductor industry still remains to be seen. There's still some ambiguity there.
Okay. And the implications for e-commerce, which is obviously so intertwined with the tech sector, they could be substantial too, right?
Absolutely. Online retailers that have a significant reliance on goods sourced from China in particular are likely to face considerable headwinds because of these tariffs. This could lead to higher prices for consumers shopping online, or it could potentially squeeze the profit margins for these e-commerce platforms if they try to absorb the costs. Something's got to give.
And there was also a mention, almost a footnote, but maybe important, about the end of a trade loophole that allowed smaller packages to enter the U.S. without tariffs. That seems like it could have a direct impact on individual consumers doing online shopping.
That's correct. It's called the de minimis rule. Previously, packages valued at under $800 coming from places like China and Hong Kong could be imported into the U.S. without being subject to tariffs. That loophole has now been closed as part of these changes.
So what does that mean practically?
It means that consumers who frequently purchase smaller goods online directly from sellers in these regions, think sites like AliExpress or Temu, perhaps will likely start seeing those purchases become more expensive as tariffs are applied. That free pass is gone.
Right. Okay, so bringing this all back to you, our listener, one last time. How might these dramatic stock market fluctuations and the potential for increased prices directly affect your everyday financial life, your purchasing power?
Yeah, this is where these seemingly abstract market movements can become very tangible very quickly. First off, if you have investments in the stock market, maybe a 401k, an IRA, or just a brokerage account, particularly if you hold tech stocks or broad market index funds, you've likely witnessed some of these declines directly impacting your portfolio's value. That's the most direct hit for many people.
Yeah, checking the balance can be painful sometimes.
It definitely can be. Beyond that, the potential for higher prices on a wide range of electronics, but also other imported goods affected by tariffs, well, that could put a strain on your household budget. Things just cost more. And then on a larger scale, these kinds of significant market reactions, these big drops, they can be indicators of broader economic uncertainty. And that can have far-reaching consequences down the road for things like job security, interest rates on mortgages and car loans, and just the overall economic growth prospects. It's all interconnected.
It certainly has a lot to digest today as these global economic currents continue to shift and swirl. So maybe let's take just a moment to quickly summarize the key takeaways from these three major tech and trade news stories we've unpacked.
Sounds good. So first, we saw China implementing new export restrictions on critical rare earth elements, likely a direct response to U.S. tariffs. This move really highlights their dominant position in this vital supply chain and is almost certainly going to accelerate efforts by the U.S. and allies to build their own independent sources, less reliance.
Right. Second, we examined the European Union's escalating response to the recent U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs. France is even suggesting future retaliatory measures could target major digital services and intellectual property. That indicates a widening scope for these global trade disputes. It's not just about metal anymore.
Exactly. And finally, we delved into the significant sell-off in tech stocks following President Trump's tariff announcements. This was driven by market concerns about increased supply chain costs, potential hits to consumer spending, and just a general increase in economic uncertainty, although, as we noted, some defensive sectors proved more resilient.
It really just underscores yet again how deeply intertwined global trade, the technology sector that powers so much of our modern lives, and our individual daily experiences have become. Events that might seem geographically distant or stuck in the realm of high finance and politics. Well, they can indeed have very real and tangible impacts on the products we buy, the services we use, and even our personal financial well-being.
Precisely. Understanding these connections, seeing how one thing affects another, and anticipating the potential ripples, that's really what we aim to do here at Connecting the Dots.
And on that note, remember, we are here to help here at Snarful, so definitely reach out on our website if you have any more questions about this or anything else.
Absolutely. And finally, just a thought to leave you with as you consider these developments, the increasing trade tensions, the necessary, maybe painful adjustments happening in global supply chains, and these often volatile market reactions. It really prompts a crucial question, I think. How might businesses, large and small, and how might individual consumers like yourself need to proactively adapt to what could be shaping up to be a more protectionist and maybe inherently more volatile global trade environment in the years ahead? It's certainly something worth pondering.
That's a wrap on today's top stories. Remember, tech doesn't have to be complicated, and we're here to help connect the dots. If you've got questions or want to learn more, visit us at snarful.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.